My name's Peter Murphy from the Politics in the Pub Committee, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal people here, especially tonight. The topic is over 1 million workers on sub-minimum wages in Australia, how to reassert workplace rights. We've got speaker advertised Michael Fraser, who is very prominent in the 7-Eleven expose to address this topic tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge John Kay. He's a member of the Legislative Council for the Greens who died on Monday morning, I think, this week. And John was very often here at the podium addressing politics in the pub, and behind the scenes also giving a lot of support to Politics in the Pub as a great democratic forum in Sydney. Stuart Rees, who's on the committee, also wrote a poem about John, and as a way to give a tribute, I'd like to read that. Stuart wrote, "The visions in his disbelief about rights abuses cluttering the headlines were crammed with sanity about commitments to humanity. As those setting lights on hills, by revealing injustices, he found wind in his sails to sail towards the shores of solidarity. For those less well equipped to face the hostile currents in life's race, he read between free market lines to microphone so many truths, how false the claims in selfish times. When hopes from summer's gentle breeze gave way to gale-force sentences, all comrades cursed the arrows which now have scarred beyond repair that voice for saying what is fair. Before his time, our massive loss, his stalwart beauty, even more, must face appalling cruelty, yet solace comes from K-like stance, his humour never faltering, all leaves that fall continuing, his commitments to humanity." Okay. Perhaps we can just have a minute's silence to think about John. Okay. If he was here, he'd be saying, get into it. So I'll leave it there and introduce Michael.
Thank you for having me, Peter. Firstly, I didn't know John from the Greens. It was John, right? Yeah. But I saw a post, I think it was Janet Rice or something the other day on Facebook, and it moved me because when there's people out there that do work hard and care about the community, I think they should be valued, and we should support each other as one big family. And so I felt like, even though I didn't know that person, that there was a death in my family, so that moved me greatly. So sorry to hear about that. And by the way, this is my first speech ever, unless you count the speeches to my parents as to why I might have been able to watch The Simpsons when I was little. But my advocacy started when I moved to Runaway Bay on the Gold Coast, and I moved into a building which is basically retired wealthy people in their 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, and they discovered I could work a computer. And before I knew it, I was working on all their computers, and they were having issues with Telstra, and I saw a problem, and I saw the way that Telstra managed the problem, and I wasn't impressed. And then I had a problem, and I think we all have a Telstra story somewhere or another. But long story short, I tried to engage with Telstra, who originally wouldn't engage with me. And eventually there was an executive who jumped on a plane, and he said, "I'll come see you." And we had a meeting, and ever since then the CEO said, "Well, this executive can work with you." And we acknowledge that we do have problems. We're trying to make it better. and they took me inside to Telstra for 3 days. It was meant to be 4 days, but I actually spent 3 days there. And this executive was there for the whole time and took me through a big training process on basically what they're trying to achieve. And what I learned there, that Telstra does have problems, but their desire is to fix the problems. And I think that's a very important part, that a company is allowed to have problems. You know, we all have problems, but it's that desire to make things better. So after Telstra, there was some interaction with Optus and Virgin. Virgin weren't having problems, but I connected with them anyway. And if you read, you'll hear various interesting stories about the Commonwealth Bank spying on me as I was trying to help their victims, and some positive media and some negative media. But where I lived in Runaway Bay, I moved over the road, and there was a 7-Eleven right next door, and I'd be up working late trying to help the Commonwealth Bank victims, and there was a worker, Sam Pendham, who didn't appear to ever leave the store. And we would joke, you know, just talk about anything, and I said to him one day, I said, "You must have so much money because you never leave the store." And he said, no, I get $12 an hour, and that's a flat rate. And I didn't know anything about wages. All I knew is that it didn't sound right. And I felt, you know, connected to this guy who had studied in India. He had 3 degrees. He was smarter and more educated than I could ever be. And it wasn't fair that his owner was driving in there in 2 new cars and sitting and dining in the cafe all the time next to my place as well. In addition to that, consulting the worker on the new Mercedes he wants to buy. Which Mercedes should I buy? While the worker is saying to me, I want to save up to buy a camera lens because I want to take photos of, you know, pretty skylines and flowers and things like that. And it really hurt me that such a thing could take place in our society. It moves me, it makes me emotional. And I said, I want to do something. I want to report your worker, your franchisee to, you know, fair, and I didn't even know. I said fair trading, fair work, whoever. So I started researching, and I said, would you be okay if I reported him to Fair Work? And he said to me, no, you've got it all wrong. This is not my franchisee doing this. This is the 7-Eleven model. It happens everywhere. And you know, when people tell you things like that, you sort of get that feeling of disbelief. Surely, you know, he's exaggerating, or he's a bit emotional, and he's you know, not using his full objectivity in this matter. So I started asking around. I went into Surfers Paradise, and I'd ask in stores, and you'd find that people wouldn't give you an answer, but you'd go back, and eventually they'd tell you, I'm on $10 an hour, I'm on $8 an hour, or $12 an hour. And it was sort of at that point, I thought, I wonder if 7-Eleven know about this, because all the workers seem to know about this. So I contacted them and started speaking with, asking to meet with the CEO. And they told me, listen, we're not interested in meeting with you, don't take offence, the CEO barely meets with anybody. And I said, well, it's kind of seeming like a little bit bigger than a Fair Work issue here. I've got a sense that it's much bigger. And they said, no, we're not interested. You know, if an employee's got a problem, that's what the Fair Work's for, and we're happy to comply with whatever they do. So I continued doing my research, and I spoke to, I had dinner with a lawyer friend in Sydney, Stuart Levitt, and over some terrible meatballs, I said to him, yeah, I said to him, you know, I was telling him about the 7-Eleven, and he says to me, you know, I'm really passionate about this issue because he said he's a class action lawyer, and he said, I like to get involved in matters that actually are socially equitable, that help people, not just get $20 back in someone's pocket. And he said, you know, why don't I help you with, you know, to do some travelling and investigate this matter further. So I started travelling to Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and the Gold Coast. I did this big journey for 14 days, and all I did pretty much round the clock was walk into 7-Elevens, and I had various workers that had offered to speak in their own languages, in Chinese and various other languages to communicate the message that I was trying to give properly when we walked into stores. And what we found was, in the beginning, it was trying to prove that there was underpayment, but halfway through it became a mission of trying to find someone that was being paid correctly. And so it turned around on us, and we could not find anyone. And even when they did say they're paid correctly, they'd say, "Oh, I'm getting $50 an hour." And I say, "Well, do you realise that the rate is $24.44 an hour? So you actually got a very generous boss, so you should be very happy." And what we also discovered is that the franchisees would routinely call up the workers and pretend to be from the government, or send friends in to be from the government, to pretend to be from the government, and try and condition them mentally in how they should answer a question. And they'd basically get marked at the end of the week that you failed the test, you told them your rate, you told them you didn't know, you should say the manager's not here, I don't know. And this conditioning goes on to this day. And so there was a lot of mental conditioning happening with the workers, and it would take me sometimes 40 visits into one store to get a worker to acknowledge that they were being exploited. And I had one that I was talking to probably 3 months before we did the Four Corners, just the other day, walked past me, who said, "You're never going to change anything, don't bother, don't use my name, I'm too scared." He lived with the franchisee, and I saw him the other day when I was having a coffee, and he says to me, "I've just put a claim in, I'm getting $10,000 back." Right. And I was so happy. But it took so much time for him to feel like that was the right thing to do because of the mental conditioning. And what really disturbed me was the knowledge that head office appeared to have in all of this, because they would say to me, "I spoke to my DM today, told him about this, he said not my problem," or he said, "Of course your boss is a crook, everyone knows it, what are you going to do? Do you want a job or don't you?" And I just literally came from meeting with a worker in Sydney just now who has received a back pay claim, a sizable one, well in excess of $100,000, and his boss still running multiple stores unquestioned at this point. And to this day, these practices continue. So I suppose my journey was discovering that there was a systemic pattern of behaviour within 7-Eleven, and when I had enough evidence to sort of say that it wasn't one state and it wasn't one store, I felt that pushing the issue with the CEO was very important. And I wrote the letter in such a way that I felt that if he didn't respond, that he may have a legal obligation to respond. So I wrote it in such a way that he had to respond. And Slater and Gordon responded. And I looked up the lawyer, and he's a professional negligence lawyer. And I thought, why is a professional negligence lawyer responding to a CEO's email? So they were obviously very concerned about the risk there. And in the communications, Slater and Gordon said, it's a fair work matter, they should go to Fair Work. And, but if you want, we will assist you in going to, to sending off some of these complaints to Fair Work. So I wrote back and I said, "Thank you for your offer to assist sending some of these complaints to Fair Work. However, there's sort of some bigger issues here that need to be discussed. The systemic issue, which isn't really a Fair Work issue, and it needs to be addressed by the franchisor." And so in amongst the things that was written, that they wrote back to me, the lawyers said, "Oh, we're making it clear that we will not be assisting." And I wrote back and I said, "Which one is it? Are you assisting or are you not assisting?" And I don't think I got an answer to that, I'm not sure. And I just thought it was interesting the backflip they did on trying to address this problem. So, systemic problem, I took it to management, I took it to the CEO, their lawyers were involved, everybody knew based on rumour. The CEO knew based on my communications, and I sent him a number of store files, I suppose, like evidence on those stores, and they did nothing, absolutely nothing. And then when it all came out, they were surprised. And if you, I know it sounds bad, but if you watch the Senate footage and you watch their surprised face in the Senate, you'll probably see me grinning behind saying, that's ridiculous. They knew because I was talking to them. So I rang the media department and I said, I want to give you my evidence. I know the CEO won't talk. And they said, don't send it to us, we don't want it. And I thought, we had to do something. And I knew that Adele Ferguson from Fairfax had has a very good reputation. And I sent her a text message asking her if she would like to look into the matter. And Adele is extremely professional and extremely detailed in her work and her research. And I thought if it passes the Adele test, it must be good. So that led to us doing a Four Corners. And I can say probably at least this many newspapers, because that's about where I ran out of money, where I bought that many newspapers. But there's stories all the time in the press, and to this very day. So the thing I think that I observed out of all of this is that we saw a pattern of foreign workers working in 7-Elevens for, we've all walked into 7-Elevens over a period of time. We've seen foreign workers in there, but a lot of us probably don't click, why is that man from India, or why does he not have a good understanding of English, and why is there every 7-Eleven having these people in? And today I've walked into a number of convenience stores in the city here today, plus in my hotel I would question the house cleaning lady in the lift. This is happening everywhere. Nobody's getting paid correctly. Well, obviously people are getting paid correctly, but there's a large number of people still being underpaid, and this is a big issue in our country. And when I think about it, we are actually part of that problem, because we either don't say anything about it, or we turn a blind eye, or we take advantage of the convenience. For example, when if you go get your nails done, a lot of those places underpay people, but would you be happy to pay twice the price to get your nails done? So there's certain compromises, I think, as a community and as a country that we need to make if we really want to stamp this problem out. I've just been to India. They come with an understanding of how you work in India. The Burger King in India had 21 staff behind the counter. The Burger King in Melbourne has 4 staff behind the counter. So for them, it's sort of common to have a lot of staff being underpaid and not getting much, and you're just there to survive. So they don't really know what they're coming to when they come to Australia. And so I think the education process when you come into a country, into Australia, is very important. Knowing what to expect in your language. You can't just put it out in English and say, oh, well, the expectation of coming into Australia is that you should have a good understanding of English, and our studies show that most people can understand a book. When in reality, a lot of the workers that I spoke to, I couldn't even introduce myself, because every time I said my name, they thought I was guessing their name. So if that is the case, then how could they possibly understand what they're getting themselves into? So when people come into a country, it normally happens that a friend suggests, I can get you a job in Australia in a 7-Eleven. And the franchisee might say, have you got any friends? They bring the person in. He has no concept of anything. He's grown up in India, grown up in Pakistan or China, has no concept of what the rules are in Australia. So he's pliable. He or she, you can turn them into whatever you want. You can tell them whatever story. You can tell them that anyone in a blue suit is a government official, and they may not believe it, but they'll be wary. And they're trained that if anyone asks questions, you're not to answer, because it's someone there to trick you and get you in trouble from immigration. So if the education process is that when you come into this country, that you know what scams you're going to be exposed to, what processes are in place to avoid such things. So if an employer says to you, I'm going to pay you half, but I'll give you twice the hours, so I'm helping you, which a lot of people, they think, oh, well, that sounds good. That's a very, very common story in stores. they need to know that they'll be exposed to that scam in their language. It needs to be in their language. It needs to be when you're coming into the country, you understand. When you go to university, you understand. And as Stuart Levitt said in his submission to the Senate, that I think it was a very good suggestion that when the foreign worker should not have to have a criteria around how many hours he can work, but is he completing his studies? Are they completing their studies? That's a far more important thing. If they're doing their studies and they're getting the work done, and we remove the hour component, what that does is it gives us a situation where they can't be exploited in the same way that they are now by saying, you know, if you do more hours, I'll report you to immigration. Because that is the big threat that everybody has, including the guy today that may or may not have admitted to me that he was being underpaid. He was telling me, I don't do any more than 19 hours a week. Because he was worried that if he told me how many hours he was working, that he would be deported. It's very, very important that the education process is in place. I think that is a big way. It's the same thing with raising children. That if you teach your children what's right and what's wrong, they know when they come across it, should that be happening to me? Should my employer be doing this to me? My mum said no, so I'm going to question that. And when people come here, they need an education process, and it needs to be rigid. It can't be something that it really needs to be anybody that's coming into the country is educated on that process in their language. It wouldn't be that hard to do. And I think at least when it happens, because a lot of people take years to work out they're being exploited, they don't know. It's very, very, very concerning. Even when they're caught, scam after scam arises. And there always seems to be a flavour of 7-Eleven head office somewhere in that scam. So this Chinese guy in Melbourne and this Indian in Sydney and a Pakistani in Brisbane all get this idea together that don't know each other, but they all get it all overnight and the new scam arises. And head office says, oh, well, that's very wrong. We shouldn't have that. It's disgusting, and the chairman says how, deplorable it is, and, we're going to stamp it out. But how did that message get to 450 franchisees? And how did it travel overnight into different communities in different languages? So there always seems to be a theme of the new scam. And very disturbingly tonight, I'm hearing of a new scam which hasn't been reported anywhere, which is the now worker, because basically 7-Eleven have to back pay a lot of money. And the credibility of the workers is quite high at the moment because the franchisees are in question. So what's happening is they're now trying to make the workers not a credible source by a lot of franchisees do things like say, don't scan this product, just take the cash for it and give me the cash. And then they report it as stolen and get extra benefit. So now what they're doing is they're pressing charges. And I've heard, and it's not substantiated yet, but I've heard there's up to 32 cases of employees now having criminal charges or allegations of criminal activity being taken to the police. And what I suspect will happen next is that head office will say, we really need to question this program, this back pay panel, because we're finding that a lot of the workers are actually criminals. And I think there's a bit of a bigger strategy there, and I could be wrong, and I don't have all the facts yet, but this is the start from a very reliable source who's given me reliable information all the way. I've seen some of the messages of a new scam. So even when these companies are caught and they've said sorry and they've put their program in place, there's still a back channel always working away somewhere, whether it be the franchisee or head office or combined, something happening. And I think the biggest part here, once again, is education, because these workers do not know. If a policeman comes in and says, you've got to go and do an interview with me, they go and do the interview and they apologise for what they've done. So, which is an admission of guilt, even if they didn't do it, because they don't understand what's happening. So this is a very, very, very concerning thing that's happening in the community now. It's all about control, and I think education is the key. If you know what if you know what is being, what you're going to be exposed to, you know what to do next.